This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. I thought we'd begin this episode with the Fox update because I know everyone's worried about it. There is none. It disappeared. We think it was rabid, and that's it.
Yeah, it was way too comfortable being out in a public place. And for a long time, I mean, you heard last episode how, like for a minute or two, we were just watching that thing, and it finally ran away. So it's got to have been sick.
Yeah. Darren or someone thought there was a den on campus on the hill behind the Doty Center.
Mm.
Oh, really?
Where there might be some little fox babies.
Interesting.
Oh, that would be
Maybe.
kind of interesting.
So anyway, that's that. On more important matters, it's the last week of school for us. We're almost done with the semester. Praise the Lord. And it's always a good feeling to get through another semester.
It is.
Get everything graded.
Get to the end of a school year. I mean, by the time you're all listening to this, most of us have got our grading done. Maybe not quite.
By most, one of us. That's you.
Graduation's happened. Everybody's moved off campus, and we're getting ready to enter into our summer break, which I am definitely ready for. Just some time off to recuperate, get our brains back. There's a fatigue that sets in at the end of the school year that both the students and the faculty feel, and we need a little bit of a summer break to get ready for a new year.
Yeah, and the catalog is done again. After adding some significant new programs. Did we talk about this last week?
No, not yet.
No, we didn't really talk about it.
Well, we now
next
have
week.
a compassionate care major, which is interdisciplinary.
Compassionate care program.
It is true. A major is a part of a program.
Right.
We're trying to work on that terminology.
About that.
Bottom line is we're combining like psychology and communication skills and social ethics with a good dose of sciences, especially biological background sciences, so that students can come to Great Lakes and knock out 95% of their health requirements if they're going to go into a program like nursing or one of the many allied health professions. All of those have before you can start your program here, you need these courses out of the way.
Yeah.
So now we have a science track in our associates program, so you can get all your requirements met in 2 years, and then transfer and finish nursing, become an RN in under 2 years at LCC, MSU, a variety of schools in the state.
Yep.
Or if you want a kind of more robust interdisciplinary major, with kind of some bedside manners in our nursing, psychology of how people think, and there's a more robust major that my sister, who's a doctor, has a doctorate in nursing, says this is a dream program. That she wished she had this going into her nursing program. Yeah. And so we're able to say, we kind of got a nursing prep thing going on here, but not just nursing, a host of kinesiology, physical and occupational therapy, dental hygienist. Hygienistry.
Dental hygienics.
Yeah.
It's funny that your sister has a doctorate in nursing. That just sounds really funny to me.
Yeah. Also RN and nurse practitioner.
Yeah.
I'm just excited about the astrology program that we're adding to it. I mean, being able to, that's not a part of it. Is that one of the allied health things?
Right. But I think this is great because I think there have been a lot of students. I know.
Moves on.
That's exactly right. I am ignoring you.
It's fine.
But it's because we've had so many students in the past who have been intrigued by Great Lakes, but we don't have the kind of programming that they're really looking for. And there might be some people out there. You might be a parent of a child who's thinking, oh, that's actually really intriguing to me. Or somebody's listening going, actually, I've wanted to study that. This would be the time to get started. And what I like about it is because not only are we training people in these kind of areas, but we're doing it in a context that glorifies God, that cares about his kingdom. And seeing this as just another way that people can begin to represent God in these kinds of fields. We can help train people up to think in a kingdom mindset and to bring that mindset into these various, health-related fields.
Yeah. And each of them has at least in the associates, you get at least one, sometimes two courses with each of us.
Yep.
So there's some Bible courses that are in there as part of your kind of humanities and arts degrees.
Yep. Christian formation.
On top of that.
Yeah.
So, it's a well-rounded degree. By the time you hear this episode, you can go to the Great Lakes website, look under registrar, academic, something like that, and you'll be able to download the catalog for yourself and check it out. But we want at least 15 students in the fall in this major. And just when we were thinking about and talking about it, we already have 2 students that I know are going into the program. And these are not students who are already here.
Right.
2 students who are not here, and they're coming.
That's fantastic.
One was on the fence. The other's like, I want to come here. I just don't know what I'm going to do. And now they know, which
Yeah.
means, the prospect of them coming and staying for 4 years just grew exponentially. So
Yeah. Well, that compassionate care program, I think, is really, really intriguing. And I think it will be for a lot of people. So I'm excited about it.
chaplaincy, medical missionary, just there's like, church and mission professions, and of course, working in hospitals and with people dealing with health issues right here locally is a huge ministry when you have the right people doing it. So
Right.
Yep.
we're pretty excited about that. We don't do many commercials for the college, but we have to do this one, and we want you to spread the
Agreed.
word. Talk to your children, talk to your friends, send some students our way.
Nieces,
We have
nephews,
13
neighbors.
more to go. We only got 2, so we need
Yep.
more. And
Yep.
if you can help, that's one way you can say thank you to 5 years of almost 500 podcasts pro bono.
250 podcasts, almost 500,000 downloads.
Oh, that's the
Yeah.
that's the 500. Okay.
250, almost 500,000 downloads.
Yeah. All right. I was listening to a podcast this morning that was celebrating. I can't believe we reached 100 podcasts. I'm like, believe it.
Believe it.
Okay. So
All right. That's our
that's
commercial.
it. That's our update. The weather's beautiful. I opened my pool this week.
Oh, nice. Good for
Hopefully in
you.
a week and a half I'll be able to swim in it.
Good luck
Yep.
with that. It's a little bit brisk for me.
All right. Well, we are continuing our series on original sin.
Mhm.
And the first 2 episodes were about establishing 2 different approaches to sin. The first sin and its implications for all humanity going forward. And we talked about original sin 1, which is not really the classic doctrine of original sin, but just kind of an acknowledgement that someone sinned first and it really screwed everything up, and we're all impacted by it, and we all succumb to it and take ownership of it at some point with our own willful volition to sin.
Right.
And then there's original sin 2, which is more of the Augustinian. You see it in some forms of Catholic theology, definitely a lot in Reformed Lutheran theology. Protestant scholasticism has a lot of original sin 2. And that's the notion that somehow we all sinned in Adam's first sin,
Yeah.
and that his genetic what do you call it? What he bequeathed to us genetically, all is the sin nature, the sin contagion that is passed along through intercourse to everyone but Jesus and his mom. And
And his mom.
and I had to add that to be
Sure, be orthodox.
comprehensive.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But that the original sin is this thing that we really have no choice in.
Yeah.
Right, which then leads to it, as we saw last week in Augustine's theology, that salvation has to be 100% God, and we don't contribute anything, that we're not capable of doing any good in and of ourselves. Everything we do is always corrupt all the time, so much so that it's God's random choice before the creation of the world, where he chose who he was going to elect, who he was going to empower, who he was going to sanctify, who he was going to impute his perfect righteousness achieved in Jesus upon us, so that on Judgment Day they see Jesus' righteousness put on us. Nothing that we have done on our own is a factor, or else it would throw off the scale so far that he'd have to then kick us out of the pearly gates.
Poor guy.
So this episode, we're ready to dive into the biblical text.
Finally. I mean, great.
Doing what we do best.
And you keep saying what we do best.
I know,
but, theological thinking is part of what
That's
we
true.
like to do here. I know it's what you do best.
So you're taking me out of the theological thinking, is what
Agreed.
you're doing.
You're no theologian, Ron.
Well, you kind of took yourself out of it in saying that, but anyway.
What we
Some
like
people,
to do.
some people
What we
like to hear the
do.
theological stuff that goes in the
Yes.
church
Yeah,
history
I know.
and the philosophy.
Yeah,
I
all
get
2
it.
of them emailed me. They were-
See, they wouldn't contact you about this.
I know. They'd be like, see, I like this. I know you hate it, Sam. I don't hate it. This is fine.
But we do want to start with Genesis, where we don't really have original sin passages, but
No.
we do have the first sin, and we can talk a lot about that.
Yeah.
Right.
Because before we really jump into passages, I think it's important to lay kind of a background foundation to how the Bible talks about the implications and the effects of the sin.
Right.
Right? Because these different original sin theologies are built on what happened because of that. So what does the Bible actually say about that?
Yeah.
And so, of course, we turn to Genesis 3, where we talk about what happens, the eating of the fruit. I think we've talked about it in different times, what kind of fruit it is. Obviously.
Kiwi.
It's kiwi. I'm more of a dragon fruit guy, but okay, it's fine. And
Serpent fruit.
Ooh.
See, dragon fruit could work.
Exactly.
It could work.
I
yeah.
like it.
It's
All right.
just cognate.
We're definitely we're going to create a whole paper out of that. But but after that, the curse that God lays down, you would think that it would say, oh, and from now on, this sin and the effects of sin will be imputed upon your children and your children's children, right? That would be great passage for those who believe in original sin to have.
Right.
Unfortunately, we don't really have that.
Yeah.
So we look at the curses that are laid out in chapter 3. First, it talks about the serpent, and
Dragon.
The dragon. Yep, the dragon fruit guy. And nothing there talks about it. There's going to be conflict between the offspring, but it doesn't say the offspring are evil. It just says there's this serpent and the wild animals, and that category of creation and humanity. There's going to be problems.
Yeah.
The next is to the woman. So she's going to have difficulty in childbirth. And again, it says greatly increase, which I always tell my students that didn't mean it was always easy.
Yeah, we've had that same conversation
Right.
with people. Yeah.
But that's part of it. Now there's going to be childbirth is going to be more difficult. And then it goes right to, and then your desire will be for your husband. So it doesn't imply, or it definitely explicitly doesn't say, and it doesn't even imply that, and these children that are born are going to inherit some sort of evil.
Right.
It just says it's going to be hard to get them out of the womb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And conflict between the man and the wife.
Right.
Yeah.
Which we've talked about many times in this podcast, but that there's a problem. Like humanity's going to, constantly be in conflict.
Yeah.
Right.
The birth of the battle of the sexes, and between all social groups in which you see some kind of inequality or just difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Breeds conflict. Yeah.
So it's not there. And then when he turns to the man, he says, the ground is going to be cursed. And so him being more than like being a tender of the garden at that time and then going to be kicked out of the garden and going to have to tend the land, that's what it's talking about. It's not as though everything that comes out is going to be cursed like children. It's going to be tough. You're going to have weeds you're going to have to deal with. You as a gardener know all about that, Ron. The
I know
difficulty.
all about that,
You're
yes.
constantly fighting against the ground to produce anything of value. That doesn't say anything about children.
Right.
And the thorns and the thistles and all that, and you're going to sweat, and eventually you're going to go through your whole life fighting against all these weeds, and then what happens? You die, and then you return to the dust.
Right.
And so as you read through there's nothing that talks about the implications or the passing on of anything to children, from what I can tell. I'm open to someone refuting that, but those are the words of God. Those are the curses that come out. And so, again, it would have been nice for those who want to believe in original sin for it to say, and from here on out, everything is sinful because of this sin. But it doesn't say that.
Yeah. And cursed language isn't even used of the humans.
No.
Right. The ground is
Yeah.
cursed. The serpent is cursed.
Right.
Humans are not cursed.
No.
Yeah.
It's our sin has brought into a world phenomenon that we have to wrestle with and do better, be better.
Yeah.
But the conditions have changed, but it doesn't say we have changed at some kind of fundamental biological level.
Right.
I mean, I think at a textual level, there are two takeaways from what we see in Genesis chapter 3. And the first one is conflict.
Yes.
It's conflict between human beings. The man and the woman. There's going to be conflict between you. Conflict between human beings in the natural world. Between animals and even with the ground. The ground is not working with us; it's working against us. Animals, they're not. We're not ruling over them anymore. But now we have a conflict relationship with the animals. Like conflict just becomes the norm for every aspect of life in the world. And then after that, it's just death. Conflict and death. This is what you can look forward to now. But it doesn't say, as you rightly said, Sam, it doesn't say anything about passing this on genetically, sexually, or whatever, passing on Adam's sin into anybody else. Just conflict and death.
And is the word sin even used
Oh, I don't think so.
in Genesis 3? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Yeah, eyes were opened, knowing good and evil. I mean, what's this? Yeah.
Yeah. There's no sin language here,
Right. Yeah.
let alone the sin nature being passed along.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just what is this you have done? Not what sin have you committed.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
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 So it is kind of interesting. So, since that's not in the account itself,
Right.
anything like a doctrine of sin, we know this is where creation started to go unhinged.
Yeah.
But there's nothing about individual personal sin or passed on sin. Sin isn't even really a theme. So we'll have to go on and look at all right, where do we go after this, right? And we talk a little bit about Cain. We didn't talk about this in the pre-show, but because you have
Sure.
a language here that's getting closer, and so we'll talk about for the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11. And we can talk about what is the implications of this first fall, and do we have any tidbits? And there are some verses that are going to push us toward something like original sin, maybe, and there'll be other verses where like, you know what, God still seems to think humans are capable of deciding one way to do good or deciding to do evil.
Yeah.
That some humans lived a life that you might call righteous.
Yeah.
Right.
Not imputed righteousness from Jesus, but
Right.
like righteous on account of how
Right.
they lived.
Because of their faith. Yeah.
Yep.
So do we want to go to Cain next? Because I think it just kind of gets the language
may as well.
of sin up and running.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And by we, do you mean me or?
If you're comfortable jumping and run, that's fine. If not, I will.
Actually, look. You go ahead, Sam. There was something I want to look at real quick. I have it in my mind. So if you're reading,
Are you going to read the Septuagint?
No, it's not.
Because then we're not going to allow that.
Verse 4,
Yep.
4:6. Right. I'll read it.
Go ahead.
We know what Cain did, right? He wasn't really happy about his brother getting more props from God for his offering, and God knows that something's wrong with Cain. He's got bad, evil desires are kind of brewing, and so God speaks to him. Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? This is in 4:6. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
Yeah.
This is the first discussion about sin.
Yep.
Yep, exactly.
And it doesn't seem to be something inside or intrinsic to Cain. It's something on the outside
Yes.
of Cain
That's right.
that he's got to watch out for.
Yes, I think that's fascinating the way you frame it. Is like, if it's imputed sin or like passed on, it's something that's innate within us. But this is one of those things where if you don't do what's right, then it opens up this door that sin then comes in, right? It's not coming from the inside, it's coming from the outside. And I love the way it's framed there. And it starts with, if you do well.
Yeah.
Right?
That doesn't sound like total depravity to me.
It almost implies like your brother.
Yeah.
Like he did well.
Yeah.
You didn't do well.
Yeah.
And
Well,
because you didn't do what you were capable of doing, you make yourself susceptible to this external force, sin, coming into your life.
Right.
yeah. Well, I'm trying to track it down. I can't remember where it is in Luke's gospel where Jesus talks about like from Abel to Zechariah, and he calls him righteous Abel.
Yes.
And so I was trying to find the passage to so we could look at it specifically. But Jesus' assessment of Abel is that he was a righteous man. Like he calls him righteous Abel. And so I think that's an important piece of evidence to kind of influence how we think about Abel. In Jesus' estimation, he was a righteous dude.
Yeah. And righteous being like, how would you frame that? Like in a right state before God?
Well,
It doesn't.
so
Right. That's a whole thing. That's a whole podcast on its own.
right. Because the word righteous, I mean, it can be translated a lot of different ways. Is it right standing? Does it mean living rightly as in accordance with God? Which I think all of those probably apply. What did Jesus mean by that? But I think that, and to a degree, he was right with God because God looked down at him and said, you're living the way I would want you to live. You're living rightly. It is a right life. And so we are in right standing. So I think all of them would probably apply to Abel, which some people can't, they can't really work that out because it's like, oh no, there's nobody righteous. And Paul says that, like, there's nobody righteous in the book of Romans. That's what he says. And so how do we bring Jesus's assessment of Abel, who was a righteous guy, into alignment with Paul saying there's nobody righteous?
Yeah.
That's
Well,
probably a whole.
And we're going to
episode
try to
right
read
there.
the Old Testament without Paul yet.
I'm all for that.
Gain our bearings with
Yeah.
this
I am
so
all
that we
for
can read Paul as using this as a Jew, not a Reformed theologian.
Right.
Right.
Amen.
So we're trying to kind of get the conceptual categories that Paul was using when he said those kind of statements.
Yeah.
Right.
Not Ron. He jumps right to Jesus.
So hard not to do that. It's so hard not to do
So
that.
I mean, here's just the first example. I say right after the fall, like we have any timeline, but the first sort of generation after the fall, where seemingly people were doing, at least one person was doing good things, and the other person had the opportunity to, and was choosing not to. And that's doesn't sound like the same thing as a sin nature.
Yeah.
Yeah. And God embraces him as one and engages him as someone with potential to do good.
For sure.
Yeah.
And not like, if you allow me into your life and to do good on behalf of you and through you and for you, like I did with your brother Abel, then you might be capable of doing good things too. Just that language, those categories, entirely alien to this account.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why Augustine had to allegorize it all.
Maybe. In the very next chapter, in chapter 5, we come across a guy named Enoch. And this one is, I think, a little bit looser, a little less convincing, but it's this guy who, it just says he walked with God, and then it says after he walked with God, he was no more because God took him. and it implies this special treatment of this man by God that others did not receive. In fact, it flies in the face of the curse, like you'll eventually die and go back to dust. But Enoch did not receive that sort of consequence of sin in the world, because what we can apply is because of the quality of his life or something about him endeared him to God to receive that.
And here we need to kind of have an Old Testament, New Testament understanding of the word walk.
Yeah.
Like we tend to hyper-literalize walking, like walking in the garden and hanging out, and they were constantly,
Right. Footprints in the sand.
Yeah,
walking it's the number one New Testament way of referring to a way of life.
Yes.
Like half the time the English translations say, in your way of life, be like Jesus. But literally in Greek, it's like in your walk, like walk as he walked. Like, so walking is a metaphor for a way of life, a way of conducting yourself. So when it says that Enoch walked with God, we shouldn't assume it means the footprints in the sand next to each other until he ran into a tight spot and God picked him up.
Right.
Like, is not literal, probably.
Yeah.
Right. If Moses couldn't see God and he was the most righteous man that ever lived up until that point, right, or else he would die. Like, I doubt. Enoch was lockstep, eyes staring, gazing into God's face, walking every day. This is probably the more generic sense of walking with God in a way of life that God so approved of, kind of like he approved of Cain, that he gave him an exceptional exit from this
approved
life.
of Abel, right? You said approved of Cain, approved of Abel.
Yeah, you gotta swap those out whenever I do that.
Sorry, I just
what I
make
mean,
sure.
Not what I say.
Yeah, I know. I just want to make sure people know what we're talking about there. I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah. So it's commending his lifestyle, which seems to be in alignment with what God wanted.
Yeah.
This is pre-Torah, pre-lots of things, but whatever he was doing was commendable by God, and he was acting. Again, it doesn't say righteous, but it seems like in a right standing with God in some way.
Yeah.
So, to go overtly theological. So this
That's
is
not what we do.
The author of this passage is out Pelagicine Pelagius. Pelagius said you can't even do good except by God's grace, having the Torah and having the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit to enable us to do good. Here, he didn't have Torah, and he didn't have these other things that we as Christians have, and yet he's still somehow walking with God.
Yep.
Yeah, it's probably going way too off into the way into the the tall weeds. But I'd be kind of curious what did walking with God mean in that time period? Because of what you just said, no scripture, no special revelation, to the best of our knowledge, at least. And so, how does a guy without access to all the things we take for granted in the form of scripture walk with God? What did Enoch's life look like? I would, like I said, I don't know if we can even answer the question, but it's one of those things that it's curious enough for me to go, yeah, what did that mean?
I mean, how do you do it without the Bible app? I don't do it.
Your daily walk with God.
Right, exactly.
Well, our next relevant passage is Genesis 6:9. You got that one, Ron?
Yep. Finally. Well, I was so caught up trying to find that passage in Luke's Gospel. Genesis, yes, I can speak, 6:9. These are descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So there's the walk with God language that we saw with Enoch.
More modifiers.
Yep. But more specifically, Noah was a righteous man, righteous in his generation, blameless, I should say, in his generation. And once again, a very surprising thing to say about Noah, because I thought people couldn't be righteous until Jesus came along. And somehow putting your faith into Jesus would allow him to give his righteousness to you. But the assessment of the authors of Genesis is that he was not only righteous, he was blameless. That's a really, really bold statement to mean. And again, I go back to what we were saying about Enoch. What did it mean? How could he walk blameless before God when he didn't have access to even the kind of revelation we're used to in Scripture? I want answers. These are questions that are begging for an answer.
I think I told you my theory about his righteousness. Did I?
Probably, but I don't
His
remember
faithfulness to his wife.
Okay.
So part of the sin that we have going on after the fall, we have two kinds of sin. It's marital sin, like Adam naming his wife and exerting dominance over her and her having that battle. And then you have Lamech and taking two women for himself. And then we have in Genesis 6 early on, the sons of God taking daughters of men for themselves. Like sexual sin is like a big part. And then, of course, the violence, the killing and the objectifying wives and women in general is kind of the problem. Noah, interestingly, does not have kids until he's over 500 years old.
Right.
Like, think about what that meant. Like his wife and him together were not able to have children until 500. And lots of men during that day, especially age of survival, even today, and 100 years before now, would be like, if we can't have kids together, I need to find someone else, right? And that's what would lead most people, like Abraham, to, because his wife Sarah was barren, he would marry more women, and Jacob ran into the same thing with Rachel. They had to find more wives so they can make babies. It was just it's like the cultural default. We can't have kids together. I need another wife. But he somehow stayed with the same woman for 500 years without having kids.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some kind of devotion on his part, the way he related to his wife.
No, I think there's something to that, because I was going more towards the violence side, which is another theme that kind of dominates these early chapters of Genesis. Violence. You have Lamech, who killed a guy for just offending him, and the increasing in violence that takes place in the earth. But I think you can couple that with the breakdown of marital relations and all that, and that takes me even to the New Testament. With what do we require of the Gentiles? Things polluted by idolatry, sexual morality, blood. And at least two of those, sexual morality and blood, would be the things you're talking about here in the early chapters of Genesis. And so, yeah, they don't have special revelation the way we think about it. But he knows, I'm one flesh with my wife, and she's the only one flesh that I have. That would certainly be honoring God. And refraining from any form of violence and bloodshed, that would certainly honor God. I think God would look down at that and go, I don't see a whole lot of that on the earth. You're a pretty righteous guy. Yeah, I think that's a good assessment.
It's conjecture.
Yeah,
Say we have no clue. I think we may have some idea of what could have been happening.
The violence thing is, they're both interesting, but the violence thing, did the Noah movie paint him as a pacifist for a while?
Oh, man, that's a good question.
I feel like it did, like early on, like when he got trapped in a corner and he's like, no, we won't fight. Anyway, that would be interesting.
He certainly was not getting up into the warmongering of the wider culture.
Picked up on that. Anyway, sorry, this made me think of that.
No, you're right. I can't remember, but you're probably right.
We should go back and watch it again.
And he did have a very strained relationship with his wife in the movie.
Yeah, that was...
That probably is not what happened here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does she have a name in that movie?
I don't remember.
Yeah, I'd have to look.
In Jewish tradition, I know some books refer to her as Edna.
Edna?
Yeah.
So, I've not heard that one.
Yep.
So regardless, here we have two back-to-back people who walked with God. One's called righteous and blameless. And so it kind of pushes back against the narrative that everyone's terrible and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Do we want to move into the image stuff now?
I think we need to get to... So we have some evidence here. First of all, the lack of original sin classically.
Right.
There's nothing like those categories up and running.
Yeah.
And then we have two people who defy the notion that no one could do any good apart from Jesus or God's amazing grace enable them to do good. But then we have the passage people start with. I think we want to do this one before the Genesis 9:6.
Sure.
And that is the passage about, this is the one in our list, Genesis 8:21.
Yeah. You want me to take it? Oh, sure. Well, this was after they got off the boat, the ark, and they offered sacrifices. And verse 21 of chapter 8 says, "And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, he said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever destroy every living creature as I have done." Mm-hmm. And so that phrase, the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. And so that's taken to say, oh, see, that's what we're talking about. So from when they're born, they're always thinking about evil, doing evil, right? And that sounds like original sin to me.
Right.
That it's inherited, regardless of how it's inherited. That's how they begin life, is having this inclination toward evil.
Yeah. And to somebody who wants to interpret it that way, I would say if that was the only passage we had to work with, I could understand maybe jumping to that conclusion. But it seems like we've already had a few passages before that would challenge that interpretation. Does it mean that every single human being, is that what it's saying? Or is it just being hyperbolic? I don't mean literally every person, but broadly speaking, this is why I brought a flood upon the earth, is because it seemed like the overwhelming majority of people fall into this category.
Yeah, I think it has to be coupled with 6:5. We kind of passed by that one.
Sure.
This is what made God, after talking about, or is this before he talked about Noah being different? Yeah. Beforehand, it says the Lord saw the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And then the Lord was sorry that it grieved him to his heart, and so I got to do something.
Yeah.
So this kind of, the thoughts were always wicked all the time.
Right. Of everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think this gets combined with the passage we just read in Genesis 8 to say, there is original sin too.
Yeah.
This is what Augustine is talking about. And so they have something to work with here.
Sure.
Yeah. But 6:8, you get the exception. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord.
Yep.
And so, again, if you just go with that passage, verse 5, you might go, yes, everybody, they're all just really, really bad. But the text itself gives us Noah as an exception to that. And so I think that's just an important point to bring in. If I was having the argument with, Augustine, these are the kinds of things I'd say. Augustine, what about verse 8 here? Of course, probably didn't have verses back then. But what about the line where Noah finds favor with God? How does this factor into your thinking there? I said last time, I was like, I kind of like Pelagius at times, because I think that he's onto something. And these are the kinds of verses that lead me in that direction.
Yeah, it definitely, chapter 6 is intended to paint a picture, like the worst possible picture.
Right.
That's what it's intended to do, to justify the fact that God had to do something, and do something we would call radical.
Yeah.
And so, desperate times call for desperate measures. And so, yes, it's painting a picture of everything being awful, followed immediately by, but there's this one guy who's not that way. Even though it says everyone's that way, there's one guy who's not that way. So at the very least, there's one exception.
Right.
And then on top of that, the passage in chapter 8, it says the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. That word doesn't mean birth. It means young personhood.
Yeah.
And that's how, that lines with how most of us view children. They come out of the womb, they're not making intentional, intentionally breaking law, right?
Yeah.
They're not doing anything intentionally to mess you over. Like, they're not waking you up in the middle of the night because they hate you. That's just because they're babies, right?
They're hungry and it hurts.
Right.
Right, yeah.
At some point, though, they start to realize what's right and wrong. And that's not at 1 minute old. Right? It's much down the line. And that's what this passage is saying. From youth, when they have the choice at some point to choose right or wrong, the inclination is, I'm going to choose the wrong.
Yeah.
That's because the sin nature has to grow with their body and their brain. So they had it at youth. Their
At birth.
faculties, yes, from birth, but
Okay.
their faculties haven't been developed enough to catch up to their nature. That's kind of how it would be talked about, right? Like, it's nascent. It's in there, just like, their mature human bodies are in there somehow, and they're, but it has to grow. So it's like the nature in them starts out tiny and insignificant, and maybe it's just a selfish obsession with mom and people. Only someone who can do stuff for me is valuable to me in my world.
Right.
But then it grows and grows and grows.
Yeah.
But I think you're right on the textual level. From youth is not the same thing as saying it's from conception,
Right.
which is a big step here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you want to make the argument you just made, that's fine. This passage doesn't say that. Right. You have to get that from somewhere else and then put it back onto this passage. We haven't gotten there yet, but maybe we will.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, and for some people, there's the way some people talk about the fall, and it's kind of like God made us in His image, and then because we sinned, then that whole thing was corrupted.
Right.
And so it's almost like humanity lost the image. The image is like this. It's supposed to be a nice mirror that reflects God and His will for the world perfectly, and now it's a cracked mirror. It's warped. It's broken fundamentally. It can never image God right. And so there's some people actually use the language of like, we lost God's image. And that's why the sin, and that's why the thoughts are always evil all the time.
Right.
That's why we can say their inclinations are evil from youth. But there's actually a passage in Genesis 9:6, just a few verses later. Like, we haven't left 5 chapters.
No.
And it's all happening right here.
Right.
Yep.
And it's that I think weighs in directly on the notion that humans have lost God's image. That's chapter 9, verse 6.
Mm-hmm.
You want to read that one, Ron?
Yeah. So this is God speaking, and He says, "Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in His own image God made humankind." And so we're still looking at human beings as being image bearers. In fact, even verse 7 I think is interesting, because it says, "Be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply on it." Here the same command that God gave at creation before the fall is being reiterated. And so they're still image bearers, and they still have the same command to be fruitful and multiply. It's not like everything was thrown into chaos in Genesis chapter 3, but there's some residue of God's creation that's still present in humanity.
Yeah, through procreation, image bearers continue to populate the earth. That's the implication of this, right?
Yep.
Still human lives are still made in God's image. Therefore, their lives have intrinsic value such that you just don't go taking people's lives.
Right.
Right. And now be fruitful and multiply. So you're going to multiply those image bearers, which is the opposite of kind of the Augustine take on what happened. Like, we become sin bearers, and now be fruitful, multiply, and propagate the sin bearing, right, through intercourse, which sounds a lot more like Manichaeism,
Right.
and a lot different than both, Genesis, be fruitful, multiply, affirmed here in chapter 9, long after the fall, and even after the flood.
Right.
And so we've got a lot of distance from that fall account to still be affirming the image-bearing nature, the divine image-bearing that gets multiplied when we're fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overly restate it, but what gives this thing about not murdering people, not killing people, power, is that the very reason is everyone's creating God's image. Like that's why people have value, and so we can't stress that enough. That it hasn't been lost, it hasn't been destroyed, right? Because if it were, then people could just kill each other because that's not their value anymore. But here it says, no, clearly we're still created in such a way that we reflect God.
Yeah.
And we can talk about what's changed. Is the image marred? Is it blurry? Is it, but it's not destroyed. It's not lost.
Right.
It's just there's some work that needs to be done, perhaps.
Okay, so I'm going to toss this out there, and you guys can tell me what you think about it, especially because you're more of an Old Testament scholar than I am. But even talking about the value of blood, the blood is sacred. Blood is life, and so you don't eat an animal with its blood in it. You drain the blood out. That there's something sacred about the blood, and it has. Again, I just said it. It's association with life. If we are completely sinful, if there's nothing good in us, if we're living in a total depravity, then why is blood sacred? How can the blood be sacred? How can it be this thing that cleanses and makes things holy if we're living in this totally depraved state? Again, I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that I think about.
Well, especially the role of blood in the sacrificial system,
Right.
in the cleansing of the temple. Like, it's not without blood that things aren't made clean.
Right.
That covenants are. Yeah, so blood still has sanctifying, holy making power.
Yeah.
And it's the blood that's flowing in us, which I guess would stand in tension with the notion that, Mary had to be born immaculately apart from intercourse so she could have a pure womb so that Jesus wouldn't kind of get it, right? But if the sin nature in us, you would think then the sin nature would be in the blood.
Yeah.
Then blood in the sacrificial system would be a hard substance to make the agent for God purifying things.
Right.
Right.
To be the atonement. It would have been better to stay with water. Like, human blood's already contaminated because of sin.
Yeah.
But water comes from the sky, from God, seeps into the ground, gets purified by the great sand filter of the Earth's crust, right?
Yes.
And then returns, and water seems like would have a much better chance if original sin is being passed on genetically. It would be in the blood.
Yeah. So there's something even about that seems to challenge the notion that everything's tainted and corrupted. It's like, no, there's something valuable here that God cares about. And so we can even look at the human body and say, there's nothing good about the body. We cannot become, Docetists or whatever. That there's just nothing redeemable about the body. In fact, I think even resurrection challenges that. Why resurrect the body if it has no value? We should get away from it and never come back. So, stretch a little bit, but.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. Yeah, and so, I think if we were to start with the normal arguments for why original sin is a thing, I think we would go to that, that Genesis 6:5 passage, then you hop to the Genesis 8:21 from youth, and start building the doctrine.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's not how we roll here. It's like, no, we're in Genesis, the primeval prologue. Let's talk about the whole sin narrative here.
Yep.
And the whole sin narrative frames these passages in a way that it's hard to believe that they're saying something that people get from them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, well, we don't have to get into all this as well, but another narrative that plays into that is when sin happened, God left and God stopped interacting because God can't be
yeah.
around sin. And if everyone's sinful from birth, then God could never be around them. And yet here God always shows up and talks to them and hangs out with them. That narrative just doesn't make sense.
Helps Eve have a kid. He had more conversations with Cain than we know he had with Eve.
Right.
Right, yeah.
And perhaps Adam.
Yeah.
And then we have Enoch, then we have Noah.
Yeah, so the implication is like, if we were that sinful and God technically couldn't be around us, then why is he hanging around us?
Yeah.
Arguably a lot more after the fall than before.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. In fact, probably by necessity, like hopefully before the fall, people have a general sense of this is what we ought to do, and they do it. Now God's like, oh my gosh, I've got to spend way more time with them than I planned. I had all these other planets I was going to create, and now I can't even do that because I got to deal with these sinful people. And obviously I'm being facetious there. But it's that idea that thanks to sin, God has to interact with us way more than maybe he originally planned to, because now we just need more of his attention.
Yeah.
I don't know. Chapter 3 talks about Adam and Eve, having drinks and appetizers with God every day.
By the beach.
Oh, wait.
In the sunset.
No, it doesn't.
Oh, wait, it doesn't actually say that.
Yeah, I think where this notion of image lost, I think part of where that comes from is how the New Testament brings up image language with Jesus. So he perfectly images God, and then we are recreating his image. And so it's kind of like our old image needed to go, and the new image needed to replace it. And the new image that replaces our old image is that of Jesus.
Yeah.
But you're familiar with those images passages. I mean, what kind of work are they doing?
Which one specifically? I mean,
Colossians.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Because I was thinking about John's Gospel is where I was thinking about image. So Colossians. See, I'm so caught up in John's Gospel I can't get my head around the Colossians passage, and we're getting close to the end here. So
if you don't have it at hand, that's fine.
No, like I said, you caught me on the hop there. So now I'm like not even sure.
I mean, bottom line,
115.
It's true that we are in Christ, that we're being renewed in his image. We're being remade in his image. But that image is talking about a way of life. Like, we're embracing his lifestyle. We're imitating his practice. We are walking as he walked. We're, in that way, he perfectly images what perfect humanity looks like. And so we imitate him. We replicate. We serve as his body. We do in this world the kind of things that he was doing. But that doesn't mean that the image in us was genetically destroyed, and through baptism, we get it back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the rest of the world is still, who haven't been baptized, walk around without the image.
Right. So you're not saying it's like returning us to a pre-fall condition. It's just emulating the life that God wants all of us to live.
Yeah.
Right. This life that Jesus set for us.
It's taking our fallen sinful selves, and it's getting rid of the junk. It's repentance, so that we're living out the image of God that's still in us well. Mm-hmm. Following the pattern of Jesus, who perfectly lived out that image.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that in Colossians 1:15, it makes me also think about what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, where it uses the image language, but it's not exactly the same. We are made in God's image. We affirm that because it's what it says in Genesis. But Jesus is Emmanuel. He is God with us. And so he is human, but he's more than that. He's more than human. And one of the things that Paul is trying to emphasize in Philippians or Colossians is that Jesus is in fact God. Philippians 2, though he was God, he didn't see equality with God something he had to cling to. And so when he uses the image here, he is the image of the invisible God. Up to this point, nobody's been able to see God face to face. Not even Moses could see God face to face. But now we have, in the form of Jesus. So I think the image language there is meant to communicate that. So it's kind of Genesis, but not quite the same as Genesis.
Yeah, and being made in God's image means we have potential to reflect him and his intentions and his goodness.
Yeah.
But we also have something in us that allows us to not live up to that potential. And what Christ does is shows us a clearer picture of God, so that we know what we're striving for. Yeah. How we're trying to live.
Well, and it's just more, language applied to Jesus. It's still Old Testament language. In Exodus 4, God tells Moses, go tell Pharaoh, Israel's my firstborn son. And for Israel, that's part of their identity now. We are God's firstborn son. We have the status and the privilege that goes with being a firstborn son. But then Jesus comes along and says, but I'm really his firstborn son, like in a literal sense. And so taking the language that had always been used for Israel, but now applying it directly to himself in a way that's more technically accurate. And I see the same thing happening like with the image language here of Colossians or Philippians 2.
Yeah. And frankly, image language, if you do a search of it, it's just not a lot of it in the Bible.
Right.
It's not the storyline of the Bible is not image born, image lost, image regained,
Yeah.
go image. Like, it's just not the story.
Go image.
You know, someone's got to talk to the Bible Project folks about that. They're really hung up on this. It's like one of the things that they do that drives me crazy. Most of it I like.
Right, same.
95%.
Yeah. I think they picked up. This is the whole. I think a lot of churches pick up on that because it's a narrative that people want or need to hear. Like it gives them, talking about the value and the worth that you have in Jesus. But if they would just start and say, "You've always had it," like it hasn't been destroyed, and now Jesus comes along and gives it back to you. Jesus helps you fulfill your greatest potential. I wish it were framed that way, but instead it's the whole no, it's gone, and thank God Jesus came back, and then he imparts it to you again. That's just not how it was framed.
Yeah, and that narrative just sets us to have the wrong kind of view of other people.
Mm-hmm.
Like people who are reborn in Jesus have the image. Sorry, the rest of you, you suck.
Yeah.
You're terrible. Like, and the direction of Genesis is no. Every life is sacred. No life can be taken, right? Because every life is good.
Yeah.
And so if Jesus finally gave it back to us, or he tried to give it back to Israel, but they did a terrible job, so he took it back. It's kind of how that storyline ends up going. That's why Jesus has to give it, because Israel obviously didn't do anything good with it. Then if you follow the logic, you start to have a pejorative view of other humans made in God's image. And that allows for kind of Christian superiority complex and keeps us from seeing the image of God with someone who has embraced a sinful lifestyle that we don't approve of or the Bible doesn't approve. But still, if they bear God's image, they have value, they have potential in his sight. That would reframe how. So they're trying to do good stuff of weaving a united theme throughout the Bible that culminates in Jesus, but I think the ripple effects were maybe more harmful than they should. And I think maybe with Augustine living in the Constantinian world, where all the good people are Christians and whatever, and and the rest of them are the barbarian hordes and pagans and stuff like that. Like, I think our day we need more unity between people, more greater appreciation for other people who are not yet renewed in the image of Jesus, but who can be.
Yeah. Agree.
So that's the Old Testament foundation that we're going to build upon when we read other Old Testament passages. We got through one on our list, but I think there were others we brought in just at the outset to give us the standard by which we're going to go. So it's not everyone's not the worst. God still loves us. God still sees good in us. Now what?
Right.
So. Well, until then, thanks for joining us this episode of the After Class Podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.